He thought calling her out would be entertaining, but 10 minutes later, no one in that room was laughing. Professor Holloway smirked as Emily Carter, the quiet woman in the back, stepped toward the board, chalk trembling slightly in her hand while students exchanged knowing glances, waiting for the inevitable failure. "Take your time," he mocked, writing a problem even top students couldn't solve. The room buzzed, then fell silent. Emily's hand moved. One step, then another. Faster. Cleaner. Wrong method corrected mid-solution. Holloway's smile faded. His voice caught. And when she finished, he didn't know what scared him more, her answer, or what she'd reveal next. He thought humiliating her would be effortless, but before that hour was over, Professor Richard Holloway would wish he had never spoken her name out loud. The lecture hall at Westbridge University glowed under cold fluorescent lights, rows of polished desks stretching like quiet witnesses to yet another one of Holloway's infamous sessions, the kind students both feared and respected, where reputations could rise or collapse in a single moment. At the center stood the man himself, silver-haired, sharply dressed, every inch the authority he believed himself to be, his voice carrying with a precision that commanded silence without effort. He was known across campus not just for brilliance, but for something colder, a habit of exposing weakness publicly, as if intellect were a stage and humiliation the price of admission. And then there was Emily Carter. She sat in the back row, as she always did, her gray cardigan blending into the neutral tones of the room, her notebook filled with careful, almost meticulous handwriting that no one ever bothered to notice. She wasn't part of conversations, wasn't invited into study groups, and certainly wasn't someone anyone expected to hear from. To most, she was just there. A quiet presence, easily overlooked. Perhaps even out of place among ambitious graduate students half her age. But what no one saw was how her eyes moved, how they lingered not on the professor, but on the equations themselves, tracking patterns, catching inconsistencies, absorbing every detail. With a calm that bordered on unsettling. That morning, something shifted. It began with a simple moment, almost invisible. Holloway paused mid-lecture, his chalk hovering as he noticed her hand raised slightly, hesitant, as if unsure it deserved permission to exist. A murmur rippled across the room. No one remembered the last time Emily Carter had spoken. Holloway turned slowly, a faint smile forming, not of encouragement, but of opportunity. "Yes," he said, his tone measured, curious in a way that carried an edge. Emily's voice came soft but steady. She asked about a step in his derivation, a subtle point, barely noticeable, but enough. Enough to challenge. Enough to touch his pride. And in that instant, the atmosphere changed. The room felt it before anyone understood it. Holloway's smile sharpened. "Interesting," he said, drawing the word out just enough for the class to lean in. "Since you're paying such close attention, perhaps you'd like to come up here and show us your approach." A few students exchanged glances, some amused, others already anticipating what they assumed would follow. Emily hesitated for half a second, just long enough for the moment to stretch, then she stood. Her steps were quiet against the polished floor, each one echoing more than it should have, as if the room itself were holding its breath. When she reached the front, Holloway turned to the board and began writing, not the example from his notes, but something else entirely. Something harder. Something unsolved in the context of the class. Lines of symbols filled the board, dense, deliberate, impossible for most in that room. When he stepped aside, the chalk still in his hand, his eyes flickered with quiet satisfaction. "Take your time," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, the faintest trace of mockery curling beneath his words. A few students chuckled under their breath. Others leaned back, arms crossed, waiting for confirmation of what they already believed. Emily looked at the board, and for a moment, nothing happened. The silence stretched. Then, slowly, she reached for the chalk. Her fingers steadied. Her breathing evened. And, when she made her first mark, the room began to change. The chalk moved again, and this time it did not hesitate. A soft, deliberate line cut across the board, followed by another, each symbol placed with a precision that felt almost rehearsed, as if Emily Carter had seen this problem before, or perhaps understood it in a way no one else in that room did. At first, the students barely reacted. A few leaned toward each other, whispering quietly, expecting the mistake to come at any second, the moment where her confidence would collapse under the weight of something truly beyond her reach. Professor Holloway stood just behind her, arms crossed, watching closely, waiting. His expression carried patience, but not the kind that supported, the kind that anticipated failure. But then something unusual happened. The expected pause never came. Emily did not slow down. She did not second-guess herself. Instead, her movements became smoother, more fluid, her hand gliding across the board as if the complexity of the equations were simplifying under her touch. One line led seamlessly into the next, each step logically connected, each transition clean, efficient, undeniable. The whispers began to fade. One by one, heads lifted. The room, once filled with quiet amusement, shifted into something else entirely. Curiosity, confusion, a growing sense that something was not unfolding the way it was supposed to. Holloway's eyes narrowed slightly. He stepped closer, just enough to see her work from a better angle. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. Not doubt in the problem, but in the situation itself. Emily reached a critical point in the solution, a section where most would have stalled, where even advanced students typically made errors. Instead of forcing her way through, she paused. The silence deepened. Every eye in the room fixed on her hand, hovering just inches from the board. Then she did something no one expected. She erased a small portion of the equation Holloway had originally written. The sound of chalk against board echoed sharply in the stillness. A ripple of tension moved through the class. That was not hesitation. That was correction. Holloway's posture shifted. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice calm but tighter now, less certain. Emily did not turn around. "There is a mistake here," she said quietly, her tone respectful, but steady, grounded in something stronger than confidence. It was certainty. A few students exchanged stunned glances. No one spoke. Holloway's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, not yet. He watched as she rewrote the step, adjusting the transformation with a subtle change that most in the room would not have even recognized. And then she continued. Faster now. Not rushed, but assured. The solution unfolded in a way that felt almost elegant, as if the problem itself had been waiting for someone to understand it properly. The tension in the room became almost physical. You could hear it in the stillness, in the way no one shifted in their seats, in the way even breathing seemed quieter. When she reached the final steps, the complexity that once filled the board now appeared organized, almost simple under her structure. She wrote the final line and stepped back. The chalk clicked softly as she set it down on the tray. For a moment, nothing happened. No one moved. No one spoke. Professor Holloway stared at the board, his eyes scanning every line, every transition, searching for the flaw he expected to find. But it was not there. Not in the logic. Not in the execution. Not even in the method. In fact, what unsettled him most was not that she had solved it. It was that she had done it better. Cleaner. More efficiently than the way he himself would have presented it. The room remained completely silent. And in that silence, something shifted that could not be undone. Professor Holloway did not speak immediately, and that silence carried more weight than anything he could have said. His eyes moved slowly across the board, tracing each step Emily had written, his mind working through the logic again and again as if repetition might expose a flaw that would restore his control over the room. But the flaw did not appear. Instead, what he found was something far more unsettling. Clarity. Precision. An understanding that did not just follow the rules, but reshaped them. A chair creaked somewhere in the back row. The sound sharp in the stillness, but no one dared to break the moment. The students who had laughed minutes earlier now leaned forward, their expressions no longer amused but intent, almost cautious, as if they were witnessing something they did not yet know how to process. Emily stood quietly beside the board, Her hands relaxed at her sides, her posture unchanged, as if the magnitude of what had just happened belonged to someone else entirely. She did not look at the class. She did not look at Holloway. Her gaze rested on the equations, calm, detached, as though she had simply completed a routine task. Holloway finally exhaled, a controlled breath that betrayed more tension than he intended. "Explain this step," he said, pointing to the section where she had corrected his work, his tone measured but no longer carrying the same authority it had before. It was a request now, not a command. Emily nodded slightly and stepped closer to the board again. When she spoke, her voice remained soft, but it filled the room in a way that demanded attention. She described the inconsistency in the original transformation, the subtle shift that created a ripple effect through the entire equation. Her explanation was not rushed. It was deliberate, structured, each sentence building on the last with a clarity that made even the most complex ideas feel accessible. As she spoke, something else became evident. She was not just solving the problem. She was teaching it. A few students began to follow along, their eyes widening as the logic unfolded in front of them, connections forming where confusion had existed before. Holloway remained still, listening, his expression tightening not in anger, but in recognition. This was no accident. This was no lucky attempt. This was mastery. When Emily finished, she stepped back once more, allowing the silence to return. It came heavier this time, filled with a different kind of tension, the kind that follows a truth too clear to ignore. Holloway opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again, as if searching for words that would restore his position, but none came. For the first time in that lecture hall, he was not the one with the answer. A student near the front raised his hand slowly, then lowered it again, uncertain whether speaking would break something that felt almost fragile. Another student whispered, barely audible, "That is not how he taught it." The words lingered in the air, not as criticism, but as realization. Emily turned her head slightly, finally glancing toward the class, her expression neutral, unaffected by the shift in attention. There was no triumph in her eyes. No need for acknowledgement. Just quiet composure. Holloway stepped back from the board, giving it space as if it no longer belonged to him. The authority he carried had not disappeared, but it had been challenged in a way he could not easily reclaim. He looked at Emily, really looked at her for the first time, not as a quiet presence in the back row, but as something else entirely. Something he had failed to recognize. And in that moment, the realization settled in, not just for him, but for everyone in that room. They had not been watching someone struggle. They had been watching someone hold back. The room remained silent. But it was no longer the silence of expectation. It was the silence of understanding. The silence did not break, it deepened, stretching across the room like something alive, something no one wanted to disturb, and in that stillness Professor Holloway realized the balance had shifted in a way he could not simply lecture his way out of. He cleared his throat, a subtle attempt to regain control, but even that small sound felt out of place now, as if the room no longer belonged to him in the way it had just minutes before. "That is one approach," he said finally, his voice steady but lacking its usual edge, and the words hung in the air, noticeably insufficient against what everyone had just witnessed. A few students exchanged glances, not mocking this time, but uncertain, as if they were waiting for something more, something that would restore the familiar structure of authority they had always relied on. But it did not come. Emily remained where she was, calm, composed, her presence no longer blending into the background, but quietly commanding attention without effort. She did not speak. She did not defend her solution. She simply stood there, allowing the work on the board to speak for itself. Holloway turned back to the equations, studying them again, slower now, more carefully, and the realization settled deeper with every passing second. He could not dismiss it. Not honestly. Not in front of a room full of students who had just followed every step and understood exactly what she had done. His fingers tightened slightly around the piece of chalk he still held, then loosened as if even that small gesture felt unnecessary. "Class," he began, but stopped, the word trailing off as he searched for direction. The authority he had built over years was not gone, but it had been challenged in a way that required something more than correction. It required acknowledgement. And that was not something he gave easily. A student in the front row leaned forward, unable to hold back any longer. "That was clearer," he said quietly, not as a challenge, but as an observation, and the honesty in his voice echoed louder than any criticism could have. Another student nodded slowly, eyes still fixed on the board, piecing together the logic in real time. The room was no longer passive. It was engaged, awake, recalibrating. Holloway turned his gaze toward Emily again, this time without the trace of dismissal that had defined his earlier expression. There was something else there now. Measured respect, reluctant but undeniable. "Where did you learn that method?" he asked, and the question carried a weight that surprised even him. It was not rhetorical. It was real. Emily met his gaze for the first time since stepping to the front of the room. Her eyes were steady, not challenging, not defensive, simply present. "I have studied it for a while," she said, her voice even, offering no elaboration, no need to justify what she clearly understood. A faint ripple moved through the class, curiosity building, questions forming that no one had thought to ask before. Who was she really? Why had she been sitting quietly in the back, unnoticed, when she clearly did not belong there in the way they had assumed? Holloway nodded once, slowly, as if processing not just her answer, but everything that had led to this moment. He stepped aside, giving the board entirely to her now, a gesture small in motion but significant in meaning. The center of the room had shifted, and everyone felt it. Emily glanced at the equations one last time, then reached forward and made a final, subtle addition, a refinement so precise it elevated the entire solution, not correcting, not competing, but completing it. When she stepped back, the room did not react with applause or noise. It did something more powerful. It stayed silent. Not out of uncertainty this time, but out of recognition. And in that silence, something unspoken passed through every person present. Respect had not been demanded. It had been earned. Holloway lowered his gaze briefly, then looked back up, and for the first time, he did not see a quiet woman out of place. He saw someone who had been holding back all along, waiting for a moment that had never needed to exist. The room remained still, and nothing about it felt the same anymore. No one moved, and yet everything in that room had already changed. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above, casting the same pale glow across the lecture hall, but the atmosphere felt different now, heavier, as if every person present understood they had just witnessed something they could not easily explain. Professor Holloway stood a few feet away from the board, his usual commanding posture replaced with something quieter, more measured, as though he were recalibrating not just his lecture, but his understanding of the woman standing beside it. He looked at the equations one more time, slower than before, tracing each line with a focus that bordered on disbelief, not because he did not understand them, but because he recognized how completely they had been redefined. He turned back to the class, opening his mouth to continue the lecture, but the words did not come immediately. For the first time, the rhythm of his teaching had been interrupted in a way he could not simply resume. "We will revisit this method," he said finally, his voice steady but quieter, lacking the sharp certainty it once carried, and even that statement felt less like instruction and more like acknowledgement. A student near the center of the room raised his hand slowly, hesitating before speaking. "Is her solution more efficient?" he asked, his tone careful, as if unsure whether the question itself crossed an invisible line. Holloway paused, his gaze shifting briefly toward Emily before returning to the student. The answer was simple. The implication was not. "Yes," he said, and the word landed with more weight than anything else he had said that day. A subtle shift rippled through the class, not dramatic, not loud, but unmistakable. It was the sound of perception changing. Students who had dismissed Emily now looked at her differently, their curiosity replacing assumption, their silence now filled with questions instead of judgment. Emily, however, remained unchanged. She did not react to the acknowledgement. She did not seek it. Her attention drifted back to the board one last time, as if confirming something only she could see. Then she stepped slightly to the side, creating space once more, not claiming the moment, but releasing it. Holloway noticed the gesture, and something in his expression softened, just slightly. "You may return to your seat," he said, but the words no longer carried dismissal. They carried respect. Emily nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion, then turned and began walking back down the aisle. Her steps were the same as before, quiet, unhurried, but now every movement was followed, every detail observed, not because she demanded attention, but because she had redefined it. No one whispered this time. No one laughed. The room remained still, watching as she returned to the back row, to the same seat she had occupied before, yet it no longer felt like the same place. As she sat down, she opened her notebook again, her pen moving calmly across the page, continuing as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But the room could not return to what it had been. Holloway turned back to the board, lifting the chalk once more, but he did not erase her work. He left it there, intact, visible, a silent acknowledgement that something worth learning had just occurred. He began speaking again, continuing the lecture, but the tone had changed. It was less performative now, less about control, more deliberate, more precise, as though he, too, was adapting to a reality he had not expected. The students listened differently as well, more attentive, more critical, as if they had been reminded that knowledge did not belong to one voice alone. And in the back of the room, Emily Carter remained exactly as she had always been, quiet, composed, her presence no longer invisible, but undeniable. She did not look up. She did not need to. The lesson had already been learned. And in that room, under those same cold lights, something far more important than an equation had been solved, though no one dared to say it out loud. The lecture continued, but no one experienced it the same way again. The sound of chalk against the board returned, steady and controlled, yet it no longer carried the same unquestioned authority it once had. Professor Holloway spoke through the next concept with deliberate care, each word measured, each step explained more thoroughly than usual, as if he were aware that every detail would now be examined, not just accepted. The students followed closely, their attention sharpened, their minds more engaged, but their focus shifted again and again, drawn back to the back row where Emily Carter sat quietly, her pen moving with calm precision across her notebook. The contrast was impossible to ignore. She did not raise her hand again. She did not seek the spotlight she had so effortlessly commanded moments before. Instead, she returned to the role everyone had assigned her, but the illusion no longer held. A student in the middle row leaned slightly toward his neighbor, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did she even know that?" he asked, not expecting an answer, only voicing the question that lingered in every mind. His neighbor shook his head slowly, eyes still forward. "That was not luck," he murmured. The words settled quietly, but their meaning carried weight. At the front of the room, Holloway paused again, just briefly, his eyes flickering toward Emily before returning to the board. It was subtle, but noticeable. He was aware of her now in a way he had not been before, and that awareness changed how he moved, how he spoke, how he chose his next example. Instead of pushing forward into more complex territory, he adjusted, selecting a problem that aligned with the method she had demonstrated, as if testing it, confirming it, or perhaps learning from it in real time. When he finished writing, he hesitated for a fraction of a second, then stepped aside, not fully turning to the class, not fully turning to her, caught between roles he had always defined so clearly. "Does anyone want to walk through this?" he asked, his voice even, but lacking its earlier challenge. No one responded immediately. The hesitation was not from fear of failure, but from a new awareness, a shift in what was expected. The room remained still. Then, from the back, Emily's pen stopped moving. It was a small sound, barely audible, but it carried across the silence like a signal. Several students turned instinctively, their attention drawn to her once more. She did not raise her hand. She did not need to. Holloway noticed. For a moment, he considered calling on someone else, restoring the familiar rhythm, but something held him back. Instead, he nodded slightly, almost to himself, then looked directly at her. "Miss Carter," he said, and this time there was no trace of mockery, no underlying challenge, only a quiet recognition. "Would you like to share your approach?" The room held its breath again, but the tension was different now, not anticipatory, not dismissive, but respectful, even curious. Emily looked up, meeting his gaze briefly, then stood once more. Her movements were as calm as before, her presence unchanged, yet everything around her had shifted. As she walked forward again, the space seemed to adjust, making room not out of obligation, but out of understanding. When she reached the board, she glanced at the problem, studying it for a moment, then began. Her explanation was concise, efficient, each step unfolding with clarity, not repeating what had been said, but refining it, elevating it, as if she were not simply solving problems, but reshaping how they were seen. The class followed in silence, their earlier assumptions dissolving completely. And as Holloway listened, standing just off to the side, he realized something he had not expected to confront in that room. Knowledge did not diminish when shared. It expanded. And in that expansion, there was no room for pride to stand alone. When Emily finished, she stepped back once more, the chalk resting where she left it, and the room remained silent, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that needed to be understood already had been. The air in the lecture hall no longer felt like it belonged to a single voice, and as Emily stepped away from the board for the second time, the silence that followed was no longer fragile, it was settled, grounded in something everyone now understood but could not easily put into words. Professor Holloway did not move immediately, his eyes still on the equations, but this time not searching for error, not measuring for control, but absorbing, almost studying them as if they had become something new under her hand. The shift was subtle, but it was undeniable. He was no longer leading alone. A student near the back adjusted in his seat, the quiet scrape of wood against the floor breaking the stillness just enough to remind everyone they were still in a classroom, still part of something structured, something familiar yet altered. Emily turned and walked back toward her seat again, her pace unchanged, her expression calm, but now the path she walked felt different, as if the space itself acknowledged her presence in a way it never had before. Eyes followed her, not out of curiosity alone, but out of recognition. She was no longer invisible. She had become a reference point. As she sat down and opened her notebook, the simple act of writing carried a new weight, each movement steady, controlled, untouched by the attention surrounding her. At the front of the room, Holloway placed the chalk down slowly, his fingers lingering for a moment before releasing it, as though letting go of something more than just the lesson he had planned. He turned to face the class fully now, his posture upright, but his expression measured, thoughtful. "There are multiple ways to understand a problem," he said, his voice quieter than before, yet clearer, more intentional. "And sometimes, the way we have always done it is not the most complete." The words settled across the room, not as a correction, but as an admission, one that carried more impact than any authority he had previously exercised. No one responded. They did not need to. The understanding was already there. A student in the front row glanced back again at Emily, then forward, as if trying to reconcile two different versions of the same person, the one he had ignored and the one he had just witnessed. The realization lingered, uncomfortable but necessary. Holloway moved to the side of the board, leaving her solution untouched once more, and instead of erasing it, he began building from it, extending the idea, exploring the implications, not as a demonstration of control, but as a continuation. The dynamic had shifted into something more collaborative, even if unspoken. And as he spoke, there was no longer an undercurrent of challenge directed at her, only a quiet awareness that she was part of the room in a way he could no longer overlook. Time passed differently after that. Minutes stretched without tension, filled with focused attention rather than anticipation. The earlier edge of the room had softened, replaced by a kind of quiet discipline that came from witnessing something real. When the clock on the wall finally ticked toward the end of the session, its faint mechanical sound seemed louder than usual, marking not just the close of a lecture, but the end of something else as well. Holloway glanced at it briefly, then back at the class. He hesitated, just for a moment, as if considering how to conclude, how to bring the room back into a familiar structure. But instead of forcing it, he simply nodded once. "That will be all for today," he said, his tone steady, without flourish, without the usual closing remarks. The students did not rush to pack up. They moved more slowly, more thoughtfully, their conversations quiet, subdued, as if the weight of what had happened had not yet settled fully. A few glanced again toward the back row, where Emily remained seated, finishing her notes, unaffected by the shift she had created. Holloway stayed at the front, not gathering his things right away, his attention lingering on the board, on the work that had redefined the room. And in that quiet ending, there was no need for explanation, no need for acknowledgement spoken aloud. The lesson had already extended beyond the equations, beyond the lecture, into something far more lasting, something that would follow each person out of that room long after the lights dimmed and the board was finally erased. The hallway outside the lecture room carried a low hum of voices, but none of them sounded quite the same as they had before. Students who usually walked with quick confidence now slowed their steps, their conversations quieter, more deliberate, as if each of them was still replaying the same moment in their minds. The door to the classroom remained open behind them, and, through it, the board was still visible, untouched, Emily's work standing exactly where she had left it, like a quiet reminder no one could ignore. A group of students gathered near the doorway, their voices barely above a whisper. "She corrected him," one said, still sounding unsure, as if saying it out loud might somehow change it. "Not just corrected," another replied, shaking his head slowly. "She made it better." The words lingered, heavier now, no longer speculation, but recognition. Further down the hallway, Emily Carter walked alone, her steps steady, her gaze forward, her expression unchanged. She carried no trace of the attention she had drawn, no sign that anything about her day had been extraordinary. To anyone passing by who had not been in that room, she was just another student, quiet, unremarkable. But to those who had been there, she was something else entirely, something they were only beginning to understand. Behind her, the classroom remained occupied. Professor Holloway had not left. He stood near the board, his jacket still perfectly in place, but his posture less rigid, his attention fixed on the equations as if the room had emptied, but the lesson had not. His fingers brushed lightly against the edge of the chalk tray, not picking it up, not erasing anything, just there, as though the presence of the work itself required acknowledgement. For a man who had built his reputation on certainty, the absence of immediate answers felt unfamiliar, yet not unwelcome. He stepped closer to the board, reading through the solution again, this time not as a teacher evaluating a student, but as a scholar studying an idea. Each line held intention. Each transition revealed a level of understanding that could not be dismissed or simplified. He exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible in the empty room, and for the first time, there was no resistance in it. Only acceptance. A soft knock at the door broke the quiet. One of the students lingered there, hesitant, as if unsure whether it was appropriate to interrupt. "Professor," he asked carefully. Holloway turned, his expression neutral, but not distant. "Yes." The student stepped in slightly, glancing once at the board before speaking. Was that method something we were supposed to know? The question was simple, but it carried layers, curiosity, confusion, and something else beneath it, a recognition that the boundaries of what they thought they understood had shifted. Holloway looked back at the equations, then at the student. "No," he said after a brief pause. "It was not." There was no defensiveness in his tone, no attempt to reclaim authority through explanation. Just honesty. The student nodded slowly, absorbing that answer, then stepped back, leaving the room as quietly as he had entered. Holloway remained where he was, alone again with the board, with the silence, with the realization that what had happened was not a disruption, but an expansion. And somewhere down the hallway, Emily Carter disappeared into the flow of the campus, her presence dissolving back into the ordinary, as if the moment she had created belonged only to those who had been willing to see it. The building settled into its usual rhythm, footsteps echoing, doors opening and closing, voices rising and fading, but inside that lecture room, the silence lingered just a little longer, holding on to something that would not easily be erased.